Labor Senator Deborah O'Neill, one of our regulars. Senator, thanks very much for your time. I might start on the Religious Discrimination Bill. I know this has been long awaited, in particular for yourself. What do you make so far and what's been released?
Well, good afternoon, Tom. And well, I think it's very disturbing to have headlines this morning where the government is already congratulating itself and saying it's delivered on religious freedom, when the religious leaders of this country, who were supposedly going to be consulted, have come out almost to a man or a woman and said we were not adequately consulted. Now, I think that's definitely the flavour of the day, and the reality is this arbitrary timeline of 5 weeks for consultation with a closing date of 2nd of October is just adding insult to that injury. You know, Mr Morrison put himself forward as the man who was there for the religious, to a degree that significantly influenced the last 10 days of the election campaign. He has been absolutely found wanting and at this stage I would say lying to the Australian people about the degree of fair, reasonable and respectful conversation that he's had with civically interested parties, including the churches.
Well, there might be a difference between consultation, whether or not people get everything they want. As for the detail itself, though, from what you've seen so far, do you have any disagreements? Do you have any issues with what's being put forward?
Well, let's go to the reality of what is consultation. Consultation is not delivering a draft piece of complex legislation and giving 5 weeks for people to interact with that. That is not what was promised. That was not what was communicated to the Australian people before the last election, but that's what has happened. In addition to the extremely short timeline, I think the other concerning thing is the movement today by press release from Christian Porter indicating that he has directed the Australian Law Reform Commission to reduce their terms of reference. And you might recall, Tom, that that inquiry has already been ongoing, and we were expecting an interim report from that body, the Australian Law Reform Commission, in September. Well, now they've blown that timeline out, it would seem, and pushed a report off from the Australian Law Reform Commission on a much tighter terms of reference to March next year. Now, there was no consultation with church leaders, religious leaders of all faiths across the country about that action. So we've got this very deceptive set of practices going on from a government that says, they're morally righteous and they're there for the religious. All right, well, that is not the truth.
There's your view on all those processes. What about the substance from what we've seen so far? What do you make of that?
How could I possibly give full and frank and very considered communications to you about the detail of a bill that arrived yesterday afternoon? And I had to go looking for it for myself on the Attorney General's page. It wasn't sent to me.
Well, I'm just asking for your initial impressions, though, that from what you've seen so far.
Well, it exists. That's about as much as you could say at this point of time. And I think it would be really inappropriate.
Well, there's more than that, surely. We know a bit more than it exists.
Well, we really don't know that much about what the detail of this is likely to do.
OK, well, let me put some elements of what we know so far. It does seem to be unclear what it might mean for the case that has kicked off a lot of this conversation, Israel Folau. Rugby Australia, under these laws, could argue a financial hardship on its business. Folau could argue not the case, and his religious freedom has been limited. What's your take?
Well, you're right, Tom. We don't know exactly what the consequences of that would be, and there's been no adequate time for people to give it careful consideration. The reality is this government has had this matter before them internally for 2 years. They have not been able to arrive at a consensus position, and what they've done is to try and stem the blood flow inside their own party, put this out, and for me to be commenting within 24 hours on the detail of this legislation is exactly what this government wants everybody to do, be panicked into swift and well, sometimes careless responses. It's too important for us to be commenting on the detail.
OK, well, look, we might talk to you about more of the detail when you've had more of a chance.
Absolutely.
But let me ask you about the Israel Folau situation, because we know the detail of that in the two sides. That's been done to death. New laws that do come up about religious discrimination, should they allow Rugby Australia to sack Israel Folau or not?
Well, I don't think it's that simple, Tom. But one of the things that we do know, that we've signed up to an international declaration about protection of religious freedom. And one of the key words in that declaration is that people are able to manifest their religion. And that means that, when you are who you are, whether that's an expression of your faith, your race, your sexual identity, that you are able to be that person in the community, and that there need to be limits.
And does that mean in the community on Twitter in the case of Israel Folau?
Well,
so that means he should have been allowed to.
Isn't that an interesting question? And this legislation is supposed to be helping to answer that question, but I don't believe it does, Tom. I think it's raised many questions.
What should be the answer, though? Surely you formed a view on whether Israel's Folau situation.
Well, my view will be informed by further consultation with the people who this is going to impact in the community more broadly, those who are faithful people of any religious tradition and those who choose no faith with a moral response to their life in the community. I want to talk to those people.
But you can talk about the complexity of legislation. That's fine, but you can still have a view without going into the complexity or how it's done or unintended consequences. You can still have a view on whether Rugby Australia
people should be able to manifest their religion. People should be able to manifest their religion.
But what does that mean specifically for the Folau situation?
That's a great question, and that should be answered in this legislation. And from my cursory glancing at it, I don't believe that question has been answered. And I think that the Church's responses today, the leaders of all the faith traditions who were inadequately consulted, would have serious questions about what it exactly means.
Can I ask then, when you talk about manifesting, though, you lean towards him being able to express himself and not to be sacked for that. Is that what you lean towards?
Well, I think in our cosmopolitan democracy, we have to make sure that we don't put such restrictions on people that ask them to pretend to unbe who they are. We've seen that with the fight for rights for LGBTIQ people. We cannot ask people to unbe themselves. And whether that's, you can't unbe a particular race, you can't unbe LGBTIQ, but you can't also unbe a person of faith.
Right, but that sounds as though you're leaning towards Folau in that case against Rugby Australia in terms of where law should go?
That's a misrepresentation of my view. I think it's much more complex than this current piece of legislation is actually realising.
Well, the legislation aside, though, your view on the case itself, you're not willing to go one way or the other?
Not in the context of what the legislation is putting forward at the moment, but we do have complex questions to answer, and that should have been what was going on in the consultation period, and clearly it hasn't, because there's no clear answer in that legislation on that question.
We'll get some more. We'll talk again down the track, Deb ONeill, when you've had a chance to go through the bill. I want to get a couple of other questions, including this inquiry into auditing standards you're going to be a part of. You've called for whistleblowers to come forward on this. Do you think, or do you have any knowledge of illegal behaviour going on here? Well,
definitely. I have had people contact me independently of the process of the committee. The committee is receiving a lot of inquiry from people who want to tell us the truth about what's going on. And there's a very important intersection between people submitting their material to a committee and that material receiving the privilege of being committed to us. And then there's the whole whistleblower process. And people who need advice around that and are concerned, should definitely contact my office. I'm happy to assist. But there are people out there
who definitely want to tell the truth. But you've had already illegal activity put to you, people saying it's happening?
Yes, that is the case. That is the case. And
we've already had some...
Well, we've already had some submissions, and I think, Tom, the first one that's gone up on the website comes from the Institute of Certified Management Accountants. And what they've identified is very significant concern with the words true and fair with regard to these financial statements. And they say that the problem is the auditors themselves who are issuing the accounting standards. They compare the way the audit is controlled in this country to, using a university analogy, they say it's like the Big Four are setting the subject syllabus, preparing the exam paper, writing the answers to the exam, and finally giving a grade. If there's a complaint, it is that the adjudicators are of the quality of their own work. So that kind of structural problem with the way that audit standards alone is a very important contribution just from that first submission that's gone up on board. Okay. But can I say, Tom, there was a date set, an 8-week period given for a response to this particular inquiry. Now, that wasn't seen as sufficient, and it's now a matter of public record that Mr Felinski convinced his Liberal colleagues to vote to extend that out to a 12-week period for people to consult on audit. You know, if you compare that with the government's arbitrary 5 weeks for the issue of religious freedom legislation, I think it tells you a lot about this government. You know, where their allegiances lie.
I just want to move on.
And
we'll talk again down the track once we hear some more detail of that inquiry. I want to ask you finally about ICAC and what's coming out of there at the moment. Sam Dastyari says this should make Labor consider banning all personal donations. Should that be considered?
Well, I think the Australian Electoral Commission and the New South Wales Electoral Commission are the entities that absolutely need to give that proposition consideration.
Labor can make that decision though itself. That's the query.
Well, Labor has actually undertaken quite significant change in terms of governments in New South Wales since this period that's before the ICAC now. And Labor's pushing for a National Integrity Commission. And I think, Tom, that's where we are. That integrity in politics, integrity in business, this concept of moral judgment is always under attack at the moment in all of our institutions. That's why we see so many people disaffected, not just by the political processes, but by the action of banks. And I noticed today BlueScope and the recommendations from the ACCC that have gone to the DPP. We have to have much more sophisticated conversations about ethical action in the public place, in all of those spheres of business, community and politics. And the National Integrity Commission is something that I'm absolutely pushing for in Canberra. And I tell you, as a person who's been in the Labor Party for a long time now in this state, came through a very different model. I will not rest until Labor has restored the integrity of the name and the tradition for which we stand. People need to be able to trust our institution, and indeed they need to be able to trust all political parties to abide by the law. All right, well, that's OK, we're out of time. And I mean, it's quite the segue from this particular focus. This is all about New South Wales Labor and a lot of money in a plastic bag. Anyway, I'm sure we'll be talking about the National Integrity Commission I come from the Central Coast, you know, Mr Harcher and paper bags. Paper or plastic, it's wrong. It doesn't matter whether it's Labor, Liberal, Greens, Califumpian. If you break the law, you should not seek to make the law. OK, we are right out of time. Deb ONeill, thank you. Chat next time. Thank you.